Okay. Well, Acts 17, as I said, is one of my favorite chapters, and I'm certainly hoping that you have read it before and something that you have as much passion for as I do, this chapter of the book of Acts. So we're talking about Paul and his ministry efforts here, his missionary work in Acts 17, and we know that Paul was the right man to do this. God called him out, but he definitely had a stellar education. He was raised, of course, in he was a Roman citizen. Of course, he was a Pharisee, but he also certainly knew a lot about not only the Old Testament, knew Hebrew and Greek, but in this chapter, he seems to quote some Greek poets. He seems to be familiar with the Hellenism that's around him, because you remember, as there's Jewish culture, they're also surrounded by Hellenistic culture. So there's some different audiences here, but Paul certainly had some kind of formal education as far as we can see. So he knew his stuff, and it comes up in this chapter. Of course, we know that his calling was kind of similar to Jeremiah's in a way. If you read the beginning of Galatians 1, and then you read the beginning of Jeremiah 1, where Jeremiah 1, it says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And then Paul says in Galatians 1, but when he who called me set apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son in me, or to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. It's kind of interesting, kind of a similar theme there. So, of course, Paul had that encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road back in Acts 9, and that's when he saw something. That would be a post-resurrection encounter where Jesus had already ascended to the Father. We're not sure exactly what it looked like, but from what the text says, Paul heard something. He saw the light. He was blinded. So one way or the other, however Jesus appeared to him, in what form it was, that certainly was what got Paul's attention. And of course, we know Paul became a believer. And of course, the trajectory of Acts is, if you read Acts chapter 1 to 12, a lot of it is about Peter's preaching. Then you go Acts 13 and on, it's Paul's preaching. If you ever notice that, the way the preaching's set up, you get to watch Peter's sermons in Acts 1:12, and then chapter 13 on, it's Paul. So Peter and Paul. Anyway, so the three true claims of Paul that you see in Acts 17 is that he is going to talk about, with his different audiences, because he's got the Jews and he's got the Greek, or the audience at Athens, which is certainly a different audience than his first two audiences, is that Paul, of course, is going to talk about Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled in Jesus. And then he's going to be talking about, with the crowd at Athens, he's going to establish God's existence, that he's the creator, that he rose from the dead, so that's a totally different audience. So remember, he has to utilize the right method with the right audience. He definitely knew his audience, okay? And Paul, of course, being Jewish, and he was a Pharisee, and raised the Old Testament scriptures, he, of course, went to the Jews first in Thessalonica, as we'll talk about. Then he goes to the crowd in Berea, and then he's in Athens. So he definitely knows that the Jews he's going to talk to in Acts 17 at the beginning, they're Jews already believe in God. They already believe in one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were familiar with the scriptures. They weren't atheists. They weren't Jewish atheists. And so Paul has an advantage that, he's already talking to people that certainly already believe in God. And of course, as I have talked about before on another call, a lot of Jewish people today don't necessarily believe in God, because you don't really have to necessarily believe in God to be Jewish. It's ethnic. I mean, if you're ethnically Jewish, you're Jewish. So whether you believe in God or not, it's not really the most important thing. Of course, Orthodox Jews are definitely more, they think it is important to believe in God, and they have a more religious aspect to their faith. But if you talk to like liberal Jews or secular Jews, or what we call Reform Jews, they're Jewish people, they're not really as concerned about belief in a personal God. But Paul's not dealing with that kind of crowd. He's dealing with Jewish people that certainly believe in God already, and they're familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. I mean, a lot of Jewish people you may talk to today haven't even read through their own scriptures, right? If you've ever talked to a Jewish person, you show them Isaiah 53 or something else in the Old Testament, they've never even read it. So a lot of times you know more about their books than they do, okay? Especially if they're just secular, right? They don't believe in God. So let me, like, for example, before I start reading the text, for example, like, these are two Jewish students where I'm at Ohio State University who I've had many talks to. I've talked to them several times about God's existence and all our worldview beliefs and who Jesus is. And these are both Jewish twins. As you can see, they call themselves the Wildlife Brothers. They have a YouTube channel. This is Ethan and I'm trying to remember his brother's name right now. But anyway, they're at Ohio State and they're both zoology majors and they're both staunch atheists, Jewish, ethnically Jewish, but they don't believe in God. And we've had quite a few conversations with them. And then we have another student I'm actually talking to right now at Ohio State who is Jewish, who doesn't believe in God. He happens to be the nephew of this man, a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who's a really well-known author and speaker. He's actually, he teaches, I think, at New York University, but he's really a Jewish atheist as well. But his nephew goes to Ohio State. And I've been able to witness to him. He's actually talked to us several times. So it's kind of interesting. But they're all Jewish atheists. They don't believe God. There's a God. They don't believe God's personal. They haven't really read through the Old Testament. So that's where we're at with some Jewish people. Now, no, I'm sorry, going the wrong way. Now, let me go ahead and read. Give me a second here. I have to pull up my. Oh, I can't do that here, can I? Well, anyway, I'd have to stop the share and go to my the scriptures. But anyway, that's okay. I don't need to do that. We'll go ahead and keep plowing ahead here. All right. So what we see in chapter Acts 17, verses 1-4 is Paul's going to go to the audience in Thessalonica. That's his first visit. And you'll see that he says, Paul follows this pattern of going to the Jew first, right? That's a book there, by the way. It's called To the Jew First, A Case for Jewish Evangelism, Scripture and History. It's a good book. But we see, just like he does in Acts elsewhere, that his strategy in his missionary work is he goes to the synagogue first, right? And chronologically, we know the gospel message was first revealed to the Jewish people before it was revealed to the Gentiles. And that's just the pattern of mission that was set up. And of course, in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus tells the disciples, only go preach to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then he says in Matthew 15, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Sounds very exclusivistic, right? But then at the end of Matthew 28, of course, after he's resurrected, the door opens to the nations to believe. But this is kind of a little map of Paul's journeys here. If you want to see where we're going to be talking about, of course, where we talk about, he's in Thessalonica up here, right? And then he's going to go to Berea, and then he's in Athens. See, those are not too far away. He gets sent away, of course, in Acts 17. You see the middle part where they send him away, and then he ends up in Athens, right? So you see here at the top. I don't know if you can see my arrow on this map, but anyway, that's what we're talking about right in here, Thessalonica and Berea, right? These are real places. Paul was a real person, right? This isn't fiction. You're like, yeah, Eric, I knew that. Anyway. So one of the things that would happen when you had a synagogue is that you could have a visiting rabbi come in and give like a word of exhortation. And so that's one of the reasons why Paul got an audience a lot of time. They knew who Paul was. He wasn't any kind of weird outcast. I mean, they knew his background. He already had a relationship with the Jewish community, so he could get an audience there. He had an opportunity and he had a platform to go speak in these synagogues. And so he took advantage of that, of course. And so inside the synagogue, of course, there'd be Jewish people, but there also would be some non-Jews. There'd be what we call proselytes. Those were Gentiles that converted to Judaism. And then God-fearing Gentiles. Those are people like Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Cornelius was the one who came to faith, right, in Acts chapter 10. He already believed in the right God. He was a God-fearing Gentile. He believed in the God of Israel, but he hadn't heard the gospel, right? That's why God sent Peter to him to witness to him. So Paul takes advantage of this opportunity. And so he goes to the synagogue in Thessalonica, as he had done elsewhere. And right away, what he does is he uses messianic prophecy. It says here in Acts 17, as his custom was. Now, what that means is he went to the Jew first, right? Just like it says in Romans 1, the gospel's to the Jew first, then to the Greek. So that was Paul's custom. He went into the synagogue, and on the 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that Christ, the Messiah, had to suffer and rise again from the dead. And then he said, this Jesus who I'm claiming to you is the Christ. He is the Messiah. And then said some of the Jews were persuaded. Some believed, not all of them. And so right away, like I said, Paul knows his audience. They're Jews, already believe in God. They've read the Old Testament, or they've been reading some of the scriptures. He uses messianic prophecy with them. Now, the question becomes, part of the thing when you read this is, you notice Paul doesn't really tell us the texts he's using. He doesn't say, it doesn't say, Luke, who wrote this, Luke wrote the book of Acts. It doesn't say, and Paul reasoned with them from the scriptures, and here's the scriptures he read to them, right? It just says, he explained and proved to them that Jesus had to suffer and rise again from the dead, right? And we don't really know for sure what Paul was using, but we know that in the Old Testament there are passages, of course, about a suffering, rejected Messiah, such as in Psalm 22, Psalm 118 to 22, Isaiah 52 to 53, Daniel 9 talks about a Messiah that will be cut off, Zechariah 12:10. And then there's passages that talk about a ruling and kingly Messiah, like a Davidic king, right? So you kind of get this picture of 2 messianic figures in the Old Testament, but the reality of it is they merge into one person, which is Jesus, right? But it's interesting, we don't know for sure what passages Paul was referring to because he doesn't list them, but I would assume he's referring to some of these passages here that I mentioned about the suffering atoning Messiah, but like I said, we just don't know for sure. But anyway, he says he's explained to them the Messiah had to suffer, right? So anyway, now in Judaism, it's funny that they actually, it's not funny, it's just kind of ironic that after Jesus died and as time went on in the Jewish community, they begin to develop a theme of 2 messiahs, where there's one Messiah is called Messiah, son of Joseph, or Messiah ben Yosef, and the other one's called Messiah ben David, or son of David. So they kind of realize, looking at the scriptures, just like I said, the rabbis started to go back and look and say, well, it seems like there's a picture of like a suffering Messiah, rejected Messiah. There's a picture of a kingly Messiah, right? And then when the Talmud, that's part of the rabbinic literature, was written, which Jews read today, that's the oral Torah. That's the common. They believe Moses received more revelation outside of the written Torah, that this oral Torah is more, it's like commentary on the written Torah, but the Talmud's part of this. If you read it, it talks about a Messiah, like 2 different Messiahs. It says here, if the people of Israel are worthy of the Messiah, he'll come on the clouds of heaven, like is talked about in Daniel 7. If they're not worthy, he'll come on a donkey, in a lowly riding on a donkey. So that's kind of interesting. You see them almost really endorsing what we believe about Jesus. We just believe it all merges into one Messiah, right? It's kind of interesting. And then there's a guy named, he's actually still around, named John Collins. He wrote a book a long time ago on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I talked about that before. That's the community, the Essene community that broke away from the Jewish establishment, and they formed this purity community out in the desert. And we found some of their writings in Israel in the 1940s, and they believed a Messiah would come as well. But there really isn't any strong evidence that the Jews at the time of Jesus really expected a suffering Messiah. There's not a lot in the literature that we can say that, the Messiah for sure is going to suffer and rise again, or suffer, and the Jews should have believed that. That's why you notice when Jesus told them the disciples he was going to suffer and die, they didn't understand. They weren't like, oh yeah, we knew you're going to suffer and die. We've read our scriptures. No, they were kind of confused. And so there's not a lot of evidence, that they were looking for that. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily they were only looking for a ruling kingly Messiah either. There's some other messianic expectations, but after Jesus rose from the dead is when they really understood it, for sure, that he had to die. It was after they had the Holy Spirit and he opened up their eyes, they began to see it and understand it. So another question may be, if you read Acts 17, where it says here that Paul says, the Messiah had to suffer and rise again from the dead, you wonder maybe, where does it say, like in the Old Testament, that Jesus would rise from the dead? Is there anywhere where it says in the Old Testament that the Messiah, when he comes, he will rise from the dead? There's not a whole lot there. There's not really like one passage that stands out that says, when the Messiah comes, he will rise from the dead. You're not going to find that really anywhere. Okay? So you might be saying to yourself, what's Paul talking about? I mean, what if he says the Messiah to suffer and rise again from the dead? I mean, is he confused about his own scriptures? What's he referring to? Well, remember that one thing for sure is that Jesus has to be a prophet like Moses. If you read the book of John, if you notice, they're looking for a prophet to come. They talk about, is Jesus the prophet? He must be the prophet. They're talking about that prophet that was talked about in Deuteronomy 18, where Moses said, there'll be someone that comes who's going to be like me. God's going to put his words upon this person. God's going to give him the words to speak. And he's going to be just like me, like Moses. But Jesus is really a greater Moses, right? He's not just like Moses. He's even greater than Moses. But, if you read Deuteronomy 18, it says, if anyone does not listen to my words, it says up here that the prophet speaks in my name. You have to listen to the words of the prophet, and what the prophet says does not come to pass. Of course, there's warnings about that. They'd be stoned. The prophet, if he says something's going to pass, it's going to have to come to pass. And we know that Jesus said many times in his own ministry, he said he would suffer, be rejected, killed, and after 3 days rise again from the dead. So Jesus has to be a prophet like Moses. And in order to be a prophet like Moses, you also have to give the right predictions. Jesus predicted he'd rise again from the dead, but he also has to do signs. Moses did signs. Moses did these miracles, those signs, he did in front of Pharaoh and everything. Jesus did signs as well. He's like a miracle. Of course, he did his miracles. He does those signs. He's a sign prophet. So, and remember, he said the ultimate sign of who he is would be his resurrection. So you could say it's a possibility Paul was referring to this when he talked about the Messiah having to rise from the dead. That's one thing he may be looking at. Or he may be looking at the fact that Jesus needs to be a priest. We know that in Hebrews, it talks about we have a greater priest, right? We have a priest that intercedes perpetually, eternally. It's an eternal priest, right? And we know that Jesus is unique. He lives forever via the resurrection. But Paul could be looking at this, maybe Psalm 10:1-4 talks about Jesus is in the order of Melchizedek. He'll be a priest forever. You can't be a priest forever if you're not risen from the dead. You can't die and just die. You have to rise from the dead to be a priest forever and ever and ever, right? So Paul could have been looking at that. Maybe that, Jesus has to rise from the dead in order to be a priest, our priest forever, that of course Hebrews ended up elaborating on. But maybe he's looking at the Old Testament and saying, the Messiah has to be a priest as well. Not only has to be a prophet, he has to be a priest. And then Paul talks about in Romans 1 about the resurrection validates the fact that Jesus is on the throne of David forever. That means that he is now established as a Davidic king forever and ever and ever, because remember, all the Davidic kings died, right? They all died, but Jesus is different because he rose from the dead. Now he's on the throne of David forever. And Paul could have been looking at these Old Testament scriptures about the Davidic king. He'll have a reign and rule that will be everlasting and it'll be universal. Paul could have been looking at these saying, okay, if the Messiah comes, he's got to rise from the dead to be the Davidic king forever and ever and ever. So my point is that Paul, we don't know what Paul's looking at there as far as the Messiah rising from the dead, but we do know, traditionally, we always believe the Messiah is a prophet, priest, and king, as we believe about Jesus. Remember, we always say prophet, priest, and king. He can't be any of those things if he isn't risen from the dead. Okay, so it could be that Paul is looking at the Old Testament scriptures saying, okay, he has to be a prophet. He rises from the dead to fulfill the role of the prophet. He has to rise from the dead to fill the role as a priest and fulfill the role as a Davidic king. So that could be what Paul's doing. It's a possibility. And then we have the verses that talks about the Berean audience. Now it says here, he goes, oh, by the way, if you read what happens after Thessalonica, I think you probably know Paul got persecuted. The Jews stirred up dissension and strife, right? Some of the Jews didn't, some believe, but then the other ones pushed back on Paul, which happened a lot. He's used to that. So once again, Paul was faithful, some believed, and then of course he got pushback. That happens with a lot of us. You know, sometimes we'll see people that respond well and other people, it's the opposite. That's just the way it goes. You have to be faithful with the opportunity, right? But then he goes on in Acts 17, it says, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now, these Jews were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them, therefore, believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came thereto, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens. Okay, so he goes to Berea, and the Bereans are a little different. They're certainly very open, as we know. They are responsive. They read the scriptures. They're eager to hear. But one thing we don't want to think is that when the Bereans are like studying, it's not like they all are walking around with Bibles. Okay, they didn't have like a book, each of them sitting around, oh, let's check out the scriptures, and they have their own little Bibles on them. That's probably not what happened, okay? The Bereans, at that time, it was very hard for anyone to have an individual copy of the scriptures, okay? We take it for granted today. But at then, what they probably did, since they're in the synagogue, there was a collection of writings in the synagogue that they were looking at, okay? So it's not like they're sitting around, oh, let's look, are you reading your Bible? Yeah, I'm reading my Bible. What do you think? Oh, what do you think? That's probably not what's going on there, okay? They're looking at, like I said, the scriptures that are in the synagogue that are available to them as a community, okay? But we know they're very responsive, right? And they're positive. And that's what we desire, you know, but of course God had already prepared them ahead of time, right? So we know that Paul, it's interesting, you know, he goes into the Jewish audience with the two synagogues. And of course, there's other people there that aren't Jewish who end up hearing it too. But it's interesting, you know, Paul goes at that time in the world to the Jew first was, I mean, the gospel was understood to be the Jew first. Today, it's weird for a Jewish person to believe, right? Gentiles are supposed to believe, Jews are not supposed to believe. Everything's kind of turned around now, right? But what's also interesting is that when Paul goes into the audience at Athens that we're going to talk about, he's talking to people that don't believe in God. And it's kind of interesting, you know, that the crowd in Thessalonica and Berea are Jews that believe in God, but today most Jews, like a lot of them, don't believe in God anyway. So what we see is when Paul goes into Athens and he starts talking to this audience, as we're going to talk about, it's almost like I feel like when I talk to Jews today who don't believe at all, I'm dealing with a crowd at Athens. It's a similar crowd because I have to just establish with them that God even exists, right? So it's kind of interesting. So Paul is certainly confronting a worldview that, you know, wouldn't necessarily be Judeo-Christian. It's very pluralistic in Athens. They believe in many gods. There's many beliefs here. And he starts talking, you know, it talks about he shows up there and he's provoked inwardly, right? About all the idolatry. If you read Acts 17, talks about how he's very provoked by what he sees. And that, of course, is the fact that he's a monotheistic Pharisee Jew now believing in Jesus. And now he believed in one God his whole life. And he knows that Jews really had a problem with idolatry, right? So now he's going to Athens. He sees all these statues or all these, these false gods, and of course he's provoked inwardly, right? And the first audience he deals with is, what I'm going to do. Actually, this is not, I'm going to go get, my Bible's right here. Just give me a second. This will probably help. Okay. This will help. Okay, so when he goes to Acts, it goes into to the crowded Athens. Okay, it says here in Acts 17, it says, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, verse 16, his spirit within him was disturbed with the sight full of idols, right? So he began holding discussions in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearers. Once again, there's the God-fearers, the ones who believe in God, but they don't believe in Jesus yet, but they believe in the right God, like Cornelius. And in the market square every day with the people who happen to be there. So apparently there's a synagogue there, ironically. And you notice it says here, Paul was having discussions. If you look at the way Paul did his evangelism, you notice, just like other passages, that they are giving reasons. They're speaking boldly. They're trying to persuade, arguing persuasively. Some of these other passages speak of the same thing. Apologetics is giving a defense. That's what it is, giving reasons for what you believe, why you believe. If you're talking to someone evangelistically, you're probably doing apologetics without even knowing it. But that's what they're doing. They're reasoning. They're just, so, if someone says, you can't argue anyone into the kingdom, you shouldn't argue with them. You should just, if they don't believe, just walk away. Well, if they have questions and they want to talk to you and, they're wanting to keep talking, don't do that. I mean, I assume you want to keep the conversation going. That would be the wise thing to do. Okay. So anyway, so he's in Athens now. It says here, then in verse 18, it says, also a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers started meeting with him. Now, the Epicureans were kind of interesting. There's actually still people that hold to their beliefs today. They were a school of philosophy taught by someone named Epicurus. He actually was a real person. And their views were that you embrace hedonism and just happiness or pleasure is the highest, the chief good in life. They didn't really believe in a personal God, of course. Religion wasn't important to them. They could believe really in, Paul's dealing with people that Epicureans, they, for the strict sense, they're really kind of atheists, but they also, maybe God's just irrelevant to them. It's just in this life. I mean, you just pursue hedonism. But he's dealing with them, this group called the Epicureans. And then he deals with the Stoics here as well. Stoicism was a little different. The Epicureans, they believed in some sort of divine spark, or what they believed was a principle of reason. It was like a God. But God's more everywhere. He's in everything, very kind of pantheistic, not like a personal God. And, virtue, wisdom, and goodness is the goal. And the goal is to reach union with kind of this pantheistic view of reality, that God's, you talk to people about, people say God's in everything. He's in like the trees, the rocks, everything. So they didn't really believe God was apart from creation. But God, if there's a God, he just kind of governed everything, but he was one with creation, right? He was kind of like that. Not God's out here intervening into the creation. He's just one with it. Okay, unity, and he's in everything. So Paul was dealing with that audience as well. So he's dealing with a crowd that doesn't really believe in a personal God, another crowd that doesn't really believe in a personal God, but a crowd that doesn't believe, that believes in some kind of God, but it certainly isn't a personal God, a personal creator. So both audiences don't really believe in a personal God, nor the God of the Bible, that's for sure. So it says here in verse 18, it says, a group of Epicurean Stoic philosophers started meeting with him, and some asked, what is this babbler trying to say? That means seed picker, not a good high compliment, calling Paul an idle babbler, kind of like a seed picker's, like a bird picking seeds, right? Not a high compliment. And others said he proclaimed in verse, so others, because he proclaimed the good news about Jesus and the resurrection, said he sounds like a propagandist or for foreign gods. So they brought him before the high council, saying, may we know what this new teaching you are presenting. So they give Paul the opportunity. He gets this opportunity to go before the high council. That's a great opportunity, great platform to talk. But they're kind of curious what he has to say, right? They say, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. Some of the things we are hearing from you strike us as strange. We liked them in verse 20. Some of the things we're hearing from you strike us as strange. We like to know what they mean. So see, it's kind of like the marketplace of ideas, similar to like a university. They're kind of like curious in different philosophies and ideas and things. And that's what it says here. Verse 21, all the Athenians and foreigners living there used to spend their time talking or hearing about the latest intellectual fads. I'm using the Complete Jewish Bible Translation. It sounds confusing to you, but anyway, you can follow along. So Paul's got this opportunity now. Now he's got this audience that both audiences don't really believe in a personal God. They certainly don't read the Old Testament scriptures. They're not like the Jewish audiences in Thessalonica and in Berea. So now what's Paul going to do with them? He's saying to himself, well, can I start with the Old Testament with these people? Should I just open up the Old Testament? He doesn't even start with the Bible with them, like opening up scriptures or anything. He realizes he's got to establish a creator with them. He's got to establish that there's one God, and he cares about humanity, and it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the God that he knew, right? And he's going to have to start establishing that belief with these audience. And that's very similar to today when you talk to someone that hasn't read the scriptures, or the Bible's not an authority to them. You have to sometimes just establish who is God, right? You have to establish they believe in God, who is God, what is the God they believe in, right? You can't assume anything. And so it says here in verse 22, Paul stood up in the council meeting and said, men of Athens, I see how you're very religious you are in every way, For I was walking around looking at your shrines. I even found an altar which was inscribed to an unknown God. So the one whom you're already worshiping, ignorance, is the one I proclaim to you. It's interesting. So he says they're worshiping in ignorance, some sort of being. I don't know if he really knows exactly what they're worshiping. I mean, like he's going by what the altar says to an unknown God. They seems like they believe in, possibly some sort of God that's just not knowable, right? He's not personal or knowable. And so he's going to take advantage of that and say that this God I'm about to talk to you about is knowable, right? He is personal. And so he says in verse 24, he says, the God who made the universe and everything in it, and who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in man-made temples, nor is he served by human hands as if he lacked something, since it is he himself who gives life and breath and everything to everyone. For one man, he made every nation living on the entire surface of the earth, and he fixed the limits of their territories and the periods when they would flourish. God did this so that the people would look for him and perhaps reach out and find him, although in fact, he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. Indeed, as some of the poets have said, we're actually his children. Since we are children of God, we shouldn't suppose that God's essence resembles gold, silver, stone shaped by human imagination. So he's talking about trying to establish them the one true God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's trying to show them that it is the God in the middle here, the God who is beyond nature, but interacts in the natural world. He's not a pagan God where it's not paganism where nature is God, right? There's no God, just the natural world is all there is. That's what really naturalism is, or materialism or atheism is. They just worship the creation, right? And then on the right side, the far right side, he's dealing with the Stoics, who are kind of like pantheistic. They believe that everything's one. The divine contains nature. But he's also dealing with the Epicureans, who probably are more in line with a paganism thing, believing that you just seek pleasure. But one way or the other, he sees that statue that says to an unknown God, he's going to take advantage of it and try to tell them that the God in the middle area here is the one true God. That's what you want to go for. Or you want to really talk about God. That's the God we're talking about, a personal God, a theistic God. And so what you see is that as you look at the chart here on the left, it says Paul in Acts 17. He starts with on the bottom, in the very bottom, it says Paul in Acts 17. He starts with what we call general revelation. He establishes there's a creator first with them. And then he jumps up there to the top where I say Paul in Athens. Then he starts talking about Jesus's resurrection. Now in the middle there, I say Paul's doing with Jews in Acts 17. He just dealt with the Old Testament scriptures, right? But he can't do that with this audience in Athens. He's got to start with creation, start to establish as a creator, right? Before he even talks about Jesus, right? And, that's why, the most important question in the world really is, does God exist? Okay? The question of God's existence impacts every area of our lives. And that's why it's sad that many academic settings won't deal with it. Well, you could take a philosophy of religion class, but this is one of our most popular questions on campus. But we want people to see that this question is so important. It impacts everything. It impacts the way you view reality. It impacts how you value people. Where do values come from? Why does anyone even matter? You want to fight for people? Why do people even matter to begin with? Of course, it impacts your morality and ethics. It impacts your view of where we come from. It impacts your destiny, what happens when we die. It impacts identity. Who are we? And of course, why we are here, our purpose. So the God question is a huge question. And that's why people think they're just staying busy, not dealing with it. They're losing. They are not winning. Okay. They think I just gather more stuff and stay busy and keep up my little projects and work hard and deal with my personal obligations, that this question will go away. It is not going away. Okay. So most of the clashes in our culture today are a clash of worldviews. Most of them. Transgenderism, the gay topic, abortion, all the major ethical debates revolve around worldview issues, right? And so I don't know if you've ever seen Antique Roadshow, but I love that show. I used to watch it with my mom. So if you never watch Antique Roadshow, what happens is somebody brings in an antique to this place. Like it could be a chair, it could be a cabinet, could be this, could be that. And these guys are these antique dealers, they're specialists, right? So they walk in and they say, how much is this worth? What should I do with it? That's what the customer says. Like this woman in the blue, she brings in her chairs. She says, what is this worth? What's the value? And what should I do with it? And so the antique dealer, what he's going to say to her is, well, we got to figure what this thing is. What kind of thing is it? What's it made out of? What's the nature of this thing? It looks like wood, right? But what exactly is its nature? Is it a certain kind of wood? Is it hollow? What kind of wood is it? What is the nature of this thing? And then where did it come from? He's going to ask her, where did you get this? Where did it come from? Because until you answer those two questions, you can't answer really what it's worth and what you should do with it, how it should be treated. You can't answer the question of how it should be treated until you figure out what kind of thing it is and where did it come from, right? Or what its value is, right? So, when it comes to us, is the world around us, you think about it, you can't really decide if a human has value or worth or how they should be treated if you don't really know what a human is. What kind of beings are we? Where do we come from? Right? So that's why the God, whether God exists question is so important, okay? Because that unwraps all this, okay? People fight for human rights and fight for this people group or that people group. Well, I don't, if you can't answer those first two questions, then I don't know what you're doing with the last two. I don't know how you answer the last two if you can't answer the first two. Now, in one view out there, the humans are just the result of physical, natural, material processes. We are just a glob of meat or molecular meat machines, okay? That perhaps, we're just molecular meat machines and spirits and souls and material things don't exist. We're just biological organisms. That's one view out there that certainly has been there for a long time. It's taught on college campuses. It's been around forever. That's what you learn at secular university. And then, therefore, if we are only physical meat machines, then of course we get to define whatever we want to be. We can define ourselves however we want to, right? You can define your own gender, define your own identity. Obviously, you are your own authority. Because where do you come from in that worldview? You come from what we call purposeless evolution. You're just an accident of nature. Okay, that's all you are. You came here through an accidental process. It wasn't intentional. You were not intentionally created. You just accidentally got here, right? So if that's your worldview, then that's going to impact how you view everything. And, one of my professors from years ago, he's passed away, Norm Geisler, like the grandfather of apologetics. He wrote a book called Is Man the Measure? Of course, we think man is not the measure, but without God, man is the measure of everything. You are your own authority. But in our worldview, man is both physical and spiritual. He's a free moral agent created by God in his image, right? So he has limited authority, he's accountable to God. So, once you get the God question established, it opens up the door for so many other things. That's why Paul is trying hard with this audience. He says here, I see that you're very religious. He sees in every way you're very religious. So he's not really commending or denying any kind of religious practice. He says that they really just seem to be interested in spiritual things. I mean, they have this altar that says to an unknown God, right? And in a culture in Athens, when you have all this Hellenism around them, Greco-Roman deities, they believed in many gods. Some of them around there. There was paganism, polytheism, but Paul sees this ignorance that they don't have it right. They don't believe in a personal God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what Paul says, he says, God made the world and everything in it. So, what Paul's doing is he's saying God is transcendent. He's distinct from the universe. He's not pantheistic. This is the real God. This is the God who is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. That's what Paul says. Paul says this God can't be contained by a structure, right? He can't be domesticated by religion, can't be restricted in any way. He's everywhere. But this is the real one true creator, right? Similar to what Paul says in Romans 1, when Paul establishes the creator there, when he says that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived through the creation of the world and the things that have been made. Paul says it is clear as day that there's a creator, that you should be able to look at the created world, look at the natural world, and know there is a creator behind that. He doesn't say you can see God directly, but you can see his effects. We know God by his effects. We can observe his effects in the world around us. Okay, the design of the DNA code, the design of your cell structure, the design of the molecular machines inside your body, the design of the universe, the way it's set up for life, the design of planet Earth, that has to be set up perfectly for life to get life going. There's so much evidence that the reproductive system, just that alone, to say that happened by chance, a chance accident is ridiculous. Do you realize the planning it would take for that, and the planning it would take to set up the right universe, the right planet, even to get life going? Multiply any planning you do in life by 1,000 or more, just planning that we do in the world. Think about the planning it would take to plan out a universe and an earth set up for life. So Paul says it's clear as day that there's a creator. So he's trying to establish with this audience that there is a creator, right? And of course, he says also, God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. God is self-existence. He doesn't need us. He's not dependent on us, right? Okay. And then he goes on to say, from one man, I think I didn't read this part towards the end of the chapter. He says, from one man, he created every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole world. He wants to highlight to them that we all have the same ancestor. Adam, of course, is our first human. We're all linked to him in some way, right? Because many of the ancients thought that the different races at that time had different origins, but Paul's saying that's not right. And he says God did this so that men should seek him, perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. It seems that Paul is saying that God knows where every single human is across this world geographically. He's placed people in a certain place. He knows where they are. He knows who can have access to the gospel. He knows how much people know about him, how much they don't know about him. We don't need to worry about the guy on the island. God knows where everybody is, right? He talks about we've been set up. The way God has set this up is that we should grow. It says here, God did this so that people look for him and reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from each one. We're supposed to reach out to God and seek him, right? So God is everywhere. He's available. And, if you're trying to talk to somebody about the gospel and they don't believe in these things, it's hard to, you have to sometimes back up. If they don't believe the God of the Bible exists, they don't believe the God of the Bible or Israel does miracles, or that Israel reveals himself, the God of Israel reveals himself, or the Bible is the word of God, then it's going to be hard to argue for a resurrection, as Paul's about to do, right? And so that's why he has to establish that there's a creator with these people, okay? This is a real personal creator, right? Who's involved in the world. He knows where everybody is and he is engaged. He's not a deistic God. And so then he says, the times of ignorance of God is overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he's fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man who he's appointed, and have that he's given assurance to all of us by raising him from the dead. So, God has given more revelation to the world through the person of Jesus. He gave revelation to the world through creation. Everybody can know there's a creator. They don't need the Bible to know there's a creator, that there's a creator. But now at the coming of Jesus, the world has more accountability to God. Okay, there's more accountability because God has revealed himself in a greater way through the coming of Christ. And by raising him from the dead, that appoints Jesus as the judge of humanity. That gives Jesus the authority to judge humanity, right? And he will judge the world one day. Okay, God's given that authority to Jesus. Okay, and so people are not ignorant that God exists. They know God exists through creation. They can know God exists through a moral law in their hearts, even though Paul doesn't talk about the moral law here. He talks about creation. But he generally reaches people about Jesus, about this part, through us. When we share the gospel, they read the Bible, they hear about it. They can figure out there's a creator, certainly, without reading the Bible. I always believed in a creator growing up. Now, I didn't know a lot about the creator until I started to read the Bible, but the point is that if you want to hear about Jesus, most people are going to hear about Jesus through someone telling them, right? That's the normative way God reaches people. And so the resurrection, of course, is the central one of the central themes in Acts, as I mentioned last week. But you notice it says here in Acts 17, he says here, after he mentions the resurrection to this audience, it says in verse 32, at the mention of a resurrection of dead people, some began to scoff. Of course, some people are like, that's ridiculous. We're We're Epicureans, we're Stoics. We don't believe in resurrection. Some of them scoffed at it. And then it says, some said it says there at the end of verse 32, it says, we want to hear you again on this. Talk about it more. We want to hear about this. So they're interested. And then in verse 33, it says, Paul left the meeting, but some stayed with him and came to trust. They came to believe in Jesus, including the high council member, this high council member here, Dionysius, and there was a woman named Damaris. So some came to believe. Is that interesting? So, you say to yourself, you read Acts 17, you're like, he went to the Jews in Thessalonica. Some believed, some of them didn't believe. They gave him a hard time. He went to Berea, had some success there. Of course, he had some opposition again after that. Then he has to move. They had to take him from there, send him to Athens. Then he's in Athens with a totally different audience. And he gives them this message, and some believe, some don't. And, the lesson of Acts 17 is that Paul is faithful to what God called him to do. Okay, that we can't worry about the results all the time. We're just absolutely infatuated with the results because we live in American culture and we're big on results and method. What works and what doesn't work. That doesn't work. You didn't get the results. Try another method. But, in Acts 17, Paul knew his audience. He knew how to reach them. And I think God will rewarded his faithfulness. He did what he was supposed to do, lead the results to God. The saying goes, be faithful to God and leave the results to God. Stop worrying about the results, right? So anyway, that's all I really have to share about Acts 17. I think it's a fascinating chapter, and I think there's a lot to learn.